Spinal white matter it just looks like a bowl of pudding. But there's some very special characteristics that differentiate spinal white matter from gray matter. Of course, the first one that you think of is that the white matter is myelinated neurons and axons, and yep, you would be correct. However, the axons are running superior to inferior through the white matter. Therefore, looking at a transverse section of spinal cord like this makes it really difficult to envision how the white matter of the spinal cord is like a multi-lane highway just running up to the brain. And on that highway at each level, there are like exit ramps. Try really hard to keep that vision in mind, a multi-laned highway with exit ramps. I'm from New Jersey, and we have something called the Garden State Parkway, and it's this like main roadway that runs between northern and southern New Jersey. And once you get on the parkway at a certain point, you can choose between going into the express lanes or the local lanes. The local lanes have exits every couple miles, whereas the express lane, you're locked into it for a good 45 minutes. And when I was younger, if you made that choice, you were locked into it. But today, there's these little places where you're allowed to get off express and onto the local or vice versa. So the same thing happens for spinal white matter. There's a phenomenon called decussation, in which an axon crosses over from the left to the right or right to left using one of those commissures that we defined in a previous mini lecture. With this idea of decussation in mind, we can also define that spinal white matter is perfectly symmetrical, as is spinal gray matter. Spinal white matter axons, they also have very specific and precise locations to each other. This is called somatotropy, very precise relationships. So even though it looks like pudding, there are very specific highways and lanes in all of that white matter. Most of the pathways that use an axon running up or down in spinal matter, most of those pathways, it's a relay. And this means that there are 2 to 3 neurons that serve that purpose of moving the information. It's only in skeletal motor neurons that we'll see one multipolar neuron originating in the brain and descending the entire spinal cord and moving out to the neuromuscular junction as one complete neuron. Otherwise, no, visceral outgoing information and sensory incoming information usually uses more than one neuron. Within these larger destinations of columns are smaller groupings of axons that have similar destinations. Like a group of axons might be headed for the pancreas or coming from the pancreas. So we call these groups with similar destinations, we call those pathways. Even more specifically, within one pathway, there can be many individual tracts, which are just axons with more specific destinations. So a tract might be headed for the head of the pancreas, whereas another tract might be headed for the tail of the pancreas. But those are both part of a pathway that's going to the pancreas. So pathways or groupings of axons destined for similar locations, they exist in these large columns of white matter. Pathways can run in 3 directions, up, down, and side to side. But we can't call them that, right? There are transverse pathways, which are just axons that are able to use these commissures to move from side to side, to decuss. There are ascending pathways that are bringing action potentials to the brain. And then there are motor pathways that are bringing action potentials from the brain. Pathways that are bringing information to the brain are called afferent. They're also called sensory. They can also be called, ascending. I just had a brain fart there. And these are carrying sensory information from peripheral tissues to the brain. There are also descending pathways or grouping of axons with similar destinations, and these would be called efferent pathways. And these are carrying outgoing information, motor information, or descending information that would be going to, for example, the neuromuscular junction of a skeletal muscle, or maybe connecting with the smooth muscle and glands of a visceral organ. It's these pathways running inferior and superior that we have to visualize as highways, and each tract is a separate lane of traffic. Of course, let's start with just some anatomical naming. There are two white matter structures called commissures, and we previously looked at these commissures where myelinated axons cross over from left to right or right to left. The anterior commissure is between the central canal and the anterior median fissure, and this right here would be that anterior commissure. The posterior commissure is between the central canal and the posterior median fissure. It's very common. Using our basic drawing here with the gray matter distribution of like a lumbar section, it makes it easy for us to see the rest of the individual columns of white matter. The dorsal column of white matter is this huge area right here. And this word dorsal column is just indicating its location. The lateral column can be seen more or less obviously at different segments of the spinal cord. So like in the cervical segments, there's a really small lateral column. In the thoracic, there's a really big lateral column. So it depends on the gray matter distribution. And then, of course, we have a ventral column, which contains the anterior median fissure and is on the ventral side. Now, again, you might be asking me, Amy, how did you know what was ventral and what was dorsal? Because this right here, that is the dorsal root ganglion, right? I also have the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus.